Hello, everyone. Welcome to another launch. So I think this is our third launch in 2 weeks. I think we had a config, we have testing, and now we're doing auth. So I know a lot of you are probably pretty excited for this because we've been talking about it for a long time. Um, so yeah, the day has come. I released auth earlier today, and so today we're going to go over what it is, why we decided to build it, and how it fits with everything else. We'll do a quick little demo of. It's not going to be quick. It's going to be a lot. There's a lot to auth. A demo of actually using the library and setting everything up, and we'll go through a few different scenarios. And for those of you that just want to know that, you can probably end it there. And then we'll also go into behind the scenes to show how some of it's implemented, some of the details. So I think Frank did this a little bit with config and testing. I think for those two is kind of the idea was, hey, it's really simple up in the front, but it's there's a lot of thought and care that goes into the back. With Auth, it's kind of different. It's kind of more around Auth is actually pretty simple, and if you look at our implementation of it, we're not inventing any kind of crazy Auth system. We're not doing any of that. We are just following certain standards, and it's actually pretty simple. So that's kind of why I want to show a little bit of behind the scenes. Yeah, people are commenting my background's different. So I am currently in my in-laws' house in Miami. We're moving down here in a month, so we came down to find a place to live, and we found one yesterday. So I'll be down here next month for any of you that are here and want to meet up. Um, okay, cool. So to get started, I'm also on a different setup, so I think the production value is going to be a little bit lower, but we'll see how this goes. Yeah, so to get started, let's talk a little bit about what SSC Auth is. I'm checking my notes. Why we decided to build it. So obviously we've had Auth in SST for a while. I think we've literally had a library construct called SST Auth. Uh, but this wasn't really an Auth system. It was just an implementation on top of Cognito. And historically, Cognito is where we've been directing people when they need to add auth to their library or to their application. So that made sense because it's an AWS native service. There's a lot of benefits to just using it. It integrates nicely with everything else. But in the past year or so of people using it, we've seen a few challenges with using Cognito. There's situations where it works great, especially when you take advantage of all the IAM integration and doing all that. But for just kind of getting a basic auth up and running, it's a lot to learn and figure out. Additionally, even beyond the basics, once you go into some more complex scenarios like multi-tenant or just kind of like changing your mind on how you want to do your user system, things like that, things like testing, Cognito can be a little bit challenging to work with. It's all generally possible, but it's pretty rough. And I think everyone probably agrees of all AWS services, Cognito is the one that gets the least amount of attention. Um, so it's just an area that we've just seen a lot of pain, and we've kind of ignored, especially with our new Create SST setup. There's no auth in there, which isn't really great because of all the parts of your system, auth is probably the one that no matter what product you're building, you're probably going to need that. So we really wanted to figure out, okay, how do we do an out of the box solution for auth? And our process for doing this was we just went and looked at every single auth service. So we looked at Cognito, obviously. We looked at Auth0. There's a bunch of like new startup-y ones that have come out in the past couple of years. We looked at all of those. Um, and we've kind of figured out a few things. I think in our head, when we think of an auth service, we think of this very discrete thing. But a lot of these different companies and different products actually combine different combinations of features. And we kind of think of all of that as like, oh, that's all auth together. But there's actually very specific different components of it. And we found that if you focus on certain components, you can deliver a lot of value. If you focus on other components, it seems like you're delivering a lot of value, but you end up creating a lot of rigidity later. And I'm gonna do a little diagram describing that. So yeah, we looked at a bunch of the auth providers. We eventually found one called WorkOS. So WorkOS isn't a general auth provider. It's very specific to doing like enterprise SSO SAML stuff. Um, and they chose a very interesting set of things to solve. It's pretty minimal. They really focus on just one specific area of auth, but they do it really well, and it is just a well implemented system. So that's where our inspiration came from. We looked at that and we're like, oh, this is what gets you one, great auth out of the box, and two, it doesn't get in your way later because it's doing very little, just focusing on the portions that are truly undifferentiated instead of trying to do everything. Um, so yeah, let me. So I think to get into a little bit of that, I'm gonna switch over to this Excalidraw, and let me try to figure out how all this works. So I go like this, and then I go like that. Oh, you're looking at a blank screen. Um, sorry, I don't have my dual monitor set up that I normally have, so I'm gonna need to pull up the stream on my phone to make sure that you all can see this properly. Wait, what? Oh, there we go. Nope, you cannot see this properly. Good thing I checked. So it is this layout or this layout. Okay. Cool. Oh, okay. So what is auth? So let's just start from, I'm basically going to draw out the typical flow of a user coming into your application and then going through different auth steps. So let's draw a little diagram of the browser. You've got the browser. Zoom in here. I'll zoom in and make this smaller. Okay, you've got the browser. And then you've got, so it's the user, and then you've got, let's say they're coming to your site for the first time. They've never signed in before, the first time they're visiting, but they click a page that needs authentication. So typically you will send them to some endpoint on your API. And this will need to, I'm bad at Excalidraw. I don't like that these are different size fonts. I'm going to copy paste. And okay, so they will come to your API, and your API will ask, "Hey, need you to prove to us who you are." Um, so typically, you can do that with your own user password system, have them submit a username and password to save and then log in with, or you can direct them to a third party who already does this and they likely have an account with already. So let's say we're going to do Google. Do this. Okay, Google. And Google will then they will then interact with Google to say, "Hey Google, this is who I am." It might involve a simple username password. It might involve a 2FA check. It might involve a bunch of steps. Right? It could involve like an hour process. It could even involve them getting on the phone and proving their identity to a human. The idea here is the third party does the hard work of saying this person is claiming to have this email. We're going to make sure that they actually do. And Google has various ways of proving that, as does several other third-party auth providers. But the idea is you don't actually do anything of that. You just kind of handle this handshake, and they'll get back to you with a set of claims. They'll say, okay, this browser who you redirected to us has proven a set of claims. So claims can be anything. It's just a general word for any piece of data that the user has proven. So in this case, it'll be something like this user has claimed that they have this email and it's associated with this Google account ID, whatever it is. Um, but at this point, you can trust that these claims are valid. So once you know that, okay, the person trying to use my site, their email is something at example.com, you can then make a request to your database and try to find them, right? So find or create. user. Because it might be a brand new user, so you want to create them, or if they're an existing user, you know their email, so you'll try to find them. So once you do that, okay, you'll get back who they are and their user ID, and this is very specific to your system, right? If you're building um, like a B2B application, this might include things like their organization ID. Depending on your application, the user object might have all kinds of properties. Um, so typically, it's best to put that in your database. And then there's a response with let's say a session token. And the session token basically will correspond to who they are, which user is it. And it's something the browser can save so that the next time they make a request to an API or they try to access something that needs authentication, let's say this is like a auth user endpoint, they are going to just send you that session token, request with token, and send it to you, and the API doesn't need to do this whole handshake with Google again. They know, okay, the session token, we already verified them once. They've hung on to it. We'll let them hang on to it for like a day, 30 days, a week, whatever it is you want to set the expiry on it. And from that on, any request to the API can use this token and authenticate without all these steps. Um, so this is generally the auth flow. If you look at things like Cognito, they implement different parts of this and they implement other stuff, right? If you look at Cognito, they definitely implement this flow, which is the flow around, uh, doing a handshake with a third party to make sure that the claims are accurate. But they also handle the user storage because you can store the user profile in Cognito, and there's like a discrete object there. And of course, they handle the session management, and they also go beyond auth. They also go, sorry, authentication. They also go into authorization. So uh, you can set permissions with the user. You can set roles sort of for the user. You can specify using IAM. Okay, they can directly upload to this bucket. They can directly access these different AWS services. Um, you can even like try to build your own like granular application level permissions using this because you might have very specific concepts in your business that need permissioning, right? If it's a project management app, let's say, this user is allowed to create a new project. This user is allowed to create issues in this other project. They can't create issues in this project, so they're not a part of it. Those application level permissions, Cognito also tries to do. And I think we've generally found that because they tried to do all of this, like literally every single part of this, that's kind of why it's not a great solution. When you store your user profile with Cognito, it's tricky because then it's like, okay, where do I store the roles? Do I store that in my database? Do I try to store it in a user attribute on the user side? Do I like figure out how to build all this on top of IAM? Um, and then sometimes like some data ends up being in the Cognito profile and you can't easily join it with the other data you have in your application. So you kind of need to be really aware of keeping these things separate. Like, okay, a user with Cognito, a user is just an account. They're not like a real user. The actual user data needs to go into my application. So this gets pretty complicated, and it's one of the reasons why we feel like Cognito isn't a great solution. And then if you go into some more complex scenarios like multi-tenant, again, it's all possible with Cognito, but very difficult because of user storage and all this stuff needs to happen here. You end up like writing a lot of stuff on top to integrate with it. If you want to do any kind of authentication strategy that Cognito doesn't support natively, like email auth, like Magic Link auth or SMS pin code auth, these are all things you end up having to write custom lambdas for. And at that point, you're kind of looking at the whole system like, all right, I wrote most of this. What's Cognito actually doing for me? So it can work, and people use it. And a lot of you use it, and I myself have used it before. But it tends to be a lot more than what most people need. And ironically, it even prevents you sometimes from doing more advanced things. So what we decided to do is drop trying to solve this part at all. This find your create user, the user storage. SST auth is not going to do that. It's probably unlikely ever going to do that. This area we find is very differentiated. Every single business has different ways that they want to do this, different ways they want to manage users, different ways they use it. it's very difficult to create a useful abstraction for this. And if you look at Cognito's user stores, it's effectively just another key value store, right? They're kind of just making you use another database for no reason. So we're not going to do this. Instead, we're going to focus on implementing this handshake really well with a bunch of third-party providers. And because I think one of the things that you can see, so I wrote this in the docs, where authentication seems complicated and scary, but if you look at modern standards, it's actually very simple. Like talking to Google or any other OAuth OIDC provider is very simple, very straightforward, and it's totally undifferentiated. Every single company, if they're talking to Google, they're going to implement this exact same handshake. So it's a really great target for building a solution for. Um, and the other side of it is a session side. So issuing session tokens, there are some nuances between, your company might do it different than another company, but in general, it's fairly simple to build a session abstraction. So we're providing a way to issue new sessions, validate sessions, make sure that this is the right person, things like that. So we focus on these two areas, and they're actually pretty easy to implement. Most of the work was around figuring out a really nice API design. The actual implementation has been very simple. And we do a lot of like little nice mini things here and there that make this all easy. Like on the session side, typically you need to manage some kind of signing key, some kind of validation key. We do all that for you, so there's no like key management at all. I'll kind of get into that a little bit later. So let me just double check my notes here. I think that's everything from for the intro. You guys can see my notes because I don't have a second screen today. Okay, yeah. So just to summarize, the areas we decided to focus on are the areas we feel like are the most boilerplate and the least differentiated. So this is a thing where you just write the same code over and over every time you do auth, and it's also code that doesn't change between projects. Okay, so now we'll do a little demo setup. So usually I do these completely cold, but I cheated this time and I already have a little bit of a setup going. So we'll kind of walk through what you would do on your own. So the new auth docs basically has a step-by-step guide of everything you need to do to set up auth and the different ways you can configure it. What I'm going to go through is more or less going to be similar. So I'll be more or less just following those docs. But yeah, so to get started, let's actually start in the constructs. So first thing we did was we actually renamed the old auth construct to Cognito. So if you're going to continue to use Cognito, if you upgrade to 1.10, there is a breaking change. You're going to have to rename all your auth references to Cognito. We actually have code in there to detect that if you didn't do that, and it'll halt everything and warn you. But it's something you're going to have to do. But if you are, not using that, you're going to use our new auth construct. You can just import the new auth construct. And the way this works is pretty simple. So let's ignore this line for now. So you initialize the new auth construct. You pass it an authenticator function, and I'll kind of go into what this is a bit later. And then you have your API, and you can attach your auth construct to the API. And what this does is it'll attach a few new routes to your API that will handle authentication. So you don't have to implement the function to handle that yourself. You can just pass in some simple configuration, and it will provide everything you need to do authentication with all kinds of front ends. So I actually built this initially for a web front end, but someone in our Discord pulled down our preview and got it working with React Native. So that kind of goes to show it can pretty easily work with anything. And that was before we even had good docs. So he was able to figure out all on his own. So you can theoretically use this for all kinds of front ends. So yeah, you attach the auth contract to the API, it'll create a few new routes. And that's it on the construct side. So again, just create the auth contract, attach to the API, you're good to go. And we'll look to see, so the only thing we need is you need to pass in a function for the actual auth handler. Typically, this would be a function you have to implement yourself, but in this case, we have implemented it for you. Here's how it works. So we have this new node package, which we've released since config. We have a new auth subpackage in there, and you can import this auth handler. So this auth handler lets you basically define a function handler without really doing any of the implementation. Instead of doing the full implementation, you can just pass in a list of auth providers that you want to support. This demo will start with the Google Auth provider. I have some stuff commented out. I'm just going to pull this out so we can look at it. Oh, whoops. I think also type safety there because I removed the. But we'll go through this anyway. So we're creating a provider called Google, and it's going to be a Google provider. Let me just double check my notes. All right, so we support a bunch of different adapters that come out of the box. We're gonna keep adding to this. So if you have something that you want supported that we don't already support, let us know. It's pretty easy for us to add a new adapter, assuming it's like a spec compliant one. But yeah, so right in this case, we're gonna use this Google adapter that you can import from the auth package. The Google adapter is a little interesting. It can do two different modes, OIDC or OAuth. I'll explain the difference later, but for this example, we're going to do OIDC. So defining adapter is pretty simple. So it moves up here. For this, so Google adapters needs this mode, and it also needs a Google client ID. So this is powered by our new config system. So you can set this using SST secrets to load it into the config. And you can just reference this here just like you do with anything else. So it's kind of a nice integration between this and the config library. And then you get an on success payload back. So if you look at this, you get a bunch of claims, what I was referring to earlier. The claims will have stuff like their email, things like that. Like I think the sub is like their Google account ID. So at this point, you'll just get a callback once a user has completed authentication for with their information. And in this example, I'm not really doing anything with it. I'm just stringifying the results and going. So, okay, I think I accidentally deployed. I shouldn't have commented out the config line. Well, it's fixed now. We'll see if this worked. So what we have set up is the auth construct. It's pointing to this function. This is all the code you need to do Google Auth. And then we'll kind of look at what this lets us do. Go to the console. Okay, go to the console. We go to the default route it creates is under, and I can actually make this part bigger, so I'm going to copy it up here so people can see it. Um, it'll create routes under this auth prefix. You can customize this if you want this to go somewhere else. That's fine. So if you go here, okay, it's erroring because I accidentally did it without the secret. So give me a second while this finishes deploying. Oh, is it done now? There we go. Okay. So if you go to this auth endpoint, it's like a little convenient playground type thing. You can see all the different providers you have configured. It was just really just a JSON payload. We'll probably eventually make this look nicer. But it is a convenient thing because then you can click here to do auth through Google. If you go here, oh, okay. I thought I did this already. Just give me 1 second. I need to configure a URL in my Google console. So the way the OAuth stuff works is it'll generate a callback URL. Whatever third party you've configured with, you will have to go there and pass in the callback URL. But there is helpful. It tells you exactly what to do. But I think my API gateway URL changed because I redeployed this. So I just need to go update it. Give me 1 second. I log into Google Cloud, which, as AWS users, I don't think any of us do that often. Okay, let me see if this worked. All right, okay. Let me share my screen again. Make this full screen so everyone can see clearly. All right, so let's go back for a second. All right, so we have this URL. Click it, we get redirected to typical Google login, and boom, we click it, and then it just prints out all the information here. So that's it, right? We just configure that stuff. It did the handshake, so it's that first part of the diagram I showed earlier, and it gives you back. This is the claims that because I logged in through Google, I've proven that these things are true about me. So you get like the email, the name, um, the sub. I think it's kind of similar to the Cognito sub, where it's like the unique ID of this user. In this case, you even get the picture, which is kind of nice. So it doesn't right now. This is set up just to like echo everything back out into the request. This is not what you would do in the real flow. But before we get into that, I want to show configuring one other adapter. So if we look here, I also have this link adapter. So this is another adapter we support. And I wanted to hide this because it demonstrates that this is a pretty flexible framework. Yes, we can do third-party login, but we can also do other types of login. So the idea behind the link adapter is it's going to be used for Magic Link login. So if you're not familiar with this, this is a form of login I highly recommend. It's very convenient. It avoids a bunch of password issues. It avoids a bunch of forgot password workflows you need to think about. It's like a little bit annoying for the user because they need to go to their email and log in, but in general, it works pretty well. So link adapter has a different set of callbacks. So instead of just an on success callback, it also has an on link callback. Basically, when a user tries to do a link adapter login, they will the SSE auth library will generate a magic link for you, and you can send it however you want. So you can send it. So this also, I think this gets a second argument with their claims. So you can start the auth with like their email. So you can send email. This is your link, link, and you can send that to like their claims email, something like that. They get the email, they can click the link, and they'll be logged in. For this demo, we're not going to do that. We're just going to echo it back out. Don't actually do this. This isn't a valid form of auth because you're just giving them their link right away. But for this demo, this will work fine. So if we go back to this auth endpoint, you see now we have two different auth providers. If we do the link one with an email, this is said it's echoing out the link. So this is a link that you would send over email. And let's say they found the email, they clicked it, boom, they're logged in. And so now you get a similar set of claims. Not as extensive because when you do email auth, all you know is, okay, they definitely proved that this is their email. You don't really know anything else about them. Again, this doesn't have to be over email, right? You can use this you can send this over anything. So instead of passing in the email, you could have passed in the phone number. You could send them an SMS. They click it on their phone, and that opens up. I think the person that did the React Native integration, what they did was they it was an email login. Once they click the link, they would redirect them to a deep link into the app. So the flow was you would go in your app, you would type in your email, then you would go to your email client, hit the link, and then it would just pop you right back into the app, into a deep link, and it all worked. So yeah, this flow is pretty flexible. You can use it for a lot of different situations. All right, so that's how the link adapter works. We have a few different adapters. They're all documented on our auth docs. So you can go in here. There's a few different ones. There's other things that you want us to implement, like post in our Discord about it, and we'll definitely consider it. It's like I said, it's pretty easy to add new ones. The one caveat I'll say is so far, ST Auth has been completely stateless. And this is, again, one of the benefits of, not benefits, of one of the trade offs we decided to make that let us implement something that's very simple, but still very powerful. Because we're not storing state for any of our auth, we don't need to know about your database. We don't need to, ask you to store data somewhere else. But that means we can't do things like password auth. So we can't automatically just, store your password somewhere. Theoretically, we can build an adapter that does password auth where you implement, you can have callbacks that are like on save password, on forgot password, on change password, things like that. And you can implement that yourself and change users' passwords, do whatever you want. But it's password auth flows are really complicated. It's not just logging in, it's also registration. It's also forgot password flows. It's also reset password flows, also change password flows. All kinds of complexity comes with passwords. And we don't feel like we can do an amazing job at an adapter for it. We can definitely make an adapter for it. But in this case, we're doing 90% of the work with the email. Sorry, and the password option we'll probably be doing like 25% of the work, and 75% of the work will still be on you. So as of now, we're not super compelled by it. But we do have ideas for other adapters. Another one I want to do is a pin code auth. So pin code auth is actually what I use for all of my applications. It's similar to Magic Link where you're sending them some kind of token and they need to, send you back the token to make sure that they are who they say they are. The benefit of pin code auth is, so the issue with the link adapter, let's say you're logging into a computer and you don't have access to your email on the computer, but you do have it on your phone. You can grab your phone and get the email, but if you click the link on your phone, you're just gonna get logged in on your phone. The nice thing about pin codes is you can just look at the pin code on your phone and type it in on your computer and be logged in. Same with like getting it over SMS. So we want to do a pin code one. It's a little more complicated because it seems like it needs state because you need to store the pin code somewhere, but we have a way to do it continuously in a stateless way. So that's one of the key things we're trying to focus on. We're trying to implement adapters that let us do completely stateless auth. So there's nothing for you to store, nothing sensitive for you to store, nothing to potentially screw up. And guys, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, where auth seems complicated, but if you use some of these modern standards, it can actually be pretty easy and it's pretty hard to mess up. All right, cool. So that is the first half of the demo. So let me just double check. Walk through Google adapter, walk through link adapter. All right, so this is basically half the app, right? At this point, we've done the authentication handshake, but we haven't issued a session. So let's kind of talk about how sessions work. Okay, so another thing we try to focus on with SST is making everything type safe. So the idea behind the session is you're issuing some kind of token to the user that they can store in their browser, their app, wherever. And that token is going to be associated with some information about them. Like most cases, their user ID. It's probably the simplest thing. And you're gonna retrieve this in your application and do different kinds of checks on it, right? Just to make sure that you even have one in the first place. Maybe you need to look up the data they're trying to access, whether the user has access to it, etc. And we want to do this in a type safe way, so you're getting strong typing for the sessions that you're getting back. So the way we do this is you can declare all your different types of sessions here. So initially it's like, what do you mean types of sessions? Like it's users logging in, what else is there? So yes, you're definitely gonna have users logging in. So we have this user session here and you have their user ID. If there's a B2B app, you might have their tenant ID. You might put some other information here about them. I think some people like to put stuff like their email in here. You can do that. I don't like doing that because sessions, like if they log in and they change their email, then the session is pointing to the wrong email. So you don't want to put stuff in here, I think, that can change. You want to put stuff that's going to stay true forever, like the user ID, tenant ID, things like that. And that's for most of you is probably be where you stop. Like you're not going to have more than one user session. Sorry, more than one type of session. You can have a session that represents the user. But in the future, you might have other things, right? You might decide to open up an API to let people do integrations with. And you might have another type of session called an API session. An API session might not have a user ID, right? Maybe it corresponds to some API key. So you're not checking that it's a user doing stuff. You want to see that it's an API key. An API key might have other properties associated with it. The idea here is, I think initially when you build an API, you have one type of entity that's consuming the API. But over time, you're going to have potentially other things that show up there. So it's nice to have this flexibility. So I'm just looking at the comments here. I haven't been looking at these. How do you get the Google Client ID? Yeah, so someone replied already. In the Google console, you can register for an account and they'll give you a Google Client ID. Question, if you were implementing an OAuth to custom adapt, would you need to implement a new adapter? No. So we actually have an out-of-the-box generic OAuth adapter. And this one just needs some basic information like the different URLs, the callback URL, token URL, things like that. And theoretically, you can implement any kind of OAuth provider using this adapter. In fact, our Google adapter isn't its own thing. It's just built on top of this OAuth adapter, just kind of a nice alias for the OAuth adapter with some stuff preloaded in. Okay, so anyway, jumping back to sessions. So yeah, session types, you can declare session types. Initially, you're probably only going to have one, but we know things change. We know your app will grow and you're going to need other ones. And the purpose of defining it there is you get type safety. So what you want to do in your onSuccess callback, if you think back to our diagram, we had something around this part of the diagram was around looking up the user and seeing if they existed, if they didn't, creating them. So I have a very simple user domain that I've implemented. So if we go here, I'll show it to you real quick. It's simply implemented with DynamoDB. Nothing super crazy. It's also not super correct, but it works for this. So we have, get a user from their ID, get a user from their email, create a user if they don't exist. So I'm going to implement something here. Again, some of you point out how it's not exactly correct, but this is just a demo. So go away. Okay, so user from email, if they exist, right? So we'll do user.from email, response.claims email. Let's start that to be true. Let's say if, or I guess this needs to be an await. And we return null. Yeah, we return null if they're not there. Okay, so if, rather than define if they're not there. If they don't exist, this will let exist equals await user create. And we'll just take an email. So then we can create them if they don't exist. Either way, it gets assigned to this exists variable. And then we can create a session. So there's a few different ways to create a session. So you can just create a session. This will return a little token for you. But for the most part, you probably want to store in a cookie or store in a query parameter so you can forward it to a front end. So in this case, we will store it in a query parameter and forward it to the front end. So you have to pick where to forward it to. We're just going to do example.com thing like that. And then you specify a type of session it is, and this is where the type safety comes in. So like I said earlier, we have these, there's a built-in type called public. That's that's a session you get when there's no session. But we defined this user session here earlier, and you can define the properties and it'll tell you, okay, this needs to be a user ID. There needs to be user ID there. So we'll just pass in the exists user ID. So this effectively will create a session and redirect them to example.com with the session token in the URL parameter. And I'll also do this for the link adapter. It's going to be pretty similar. Link adapter's callbacks are a little bit different. So all of this. Yeah, I mean, of course, you can create like nicer helper functions so that this isn't not duplicating this so much. That each adapter is a little bit different. Make both this do the same thing. Okay, now we can go back here. And let's do the Google adapter, I guess. So another question, hang on. This doesn't implement any M2M or refresh token spec. No, so this doesn't, so the session provider does not implement refresh token scheme. That's something we can definitely talk about and implement. For this example, we just have simple long-lived tokens that you can control how long they last for. If you want to split that into like a refresh token and an access token, you don't have to use our session provider. You can implement your own. It's also not that hard, but that is something we can consider implementing natively. We just wanted more feedback around what people wanted before we implemented that. But yeah, let's go through this flow. So if we go to Google, log in, boom, it's redirected me, and you can see there is this token in the URL, and we will go to this site to look at what it is. Oh. So you can see here, it is, we got the session that we issued. And if we go back to our code, I did one other thing. So this is using our GraphQL setup. So I've created a simple GraphQL user object in my API. So I have a query called session, and what session will do is it'll grab the current session, which we have this new use session hook. I'll explain how this works later, but just for this, you can import use session, and you can call it anywhere. And this is where the type safety also kicks in, right? So if you do if session, or if you do session.type, you'll see that, session.type will either be public or user. If you define other things, it'll also show up here. And once you've narrowed it by checking if it's a user, you can return the user from ID from the properties in the token. So if we take this token and go to the console and go to our GraphQL Explorer, do a query for session. Now let's get the email and the ID, and we're going to need to pass. So the way this works is you're going to need to pass an authorization header, error token. It's not a token. This is a token. Boom, and it works. And you see it's found my session and my ID and then the email. And if you don't include this, it gives you null because it can't find it. And that is pretty much everything. So yeah, to recap, we have the auth construct, it attaches the API. We implement this auth function with a bunch of this pretty simple configuration around what providers want to support. And once you do that, it will do the work of issuing, like authenticating a user and issuing a session. And then anywhere in your function code, you can just call use session to get the current session. You can build kind of nice wrappers around this, right? So something I like doing is to do something like require user. And this will do, yeah, this looks right. If user session type is not equal user, I'll say something like expected user session. And then here I can do, or then I will return session, which has now been narrowed, right? We know it's a user at this point. So we can do something like, we can rewrite this to const session equals our user. And then this code gets simplified to just this. That all works, all type checked and it's correct. It works. And if I remove the header, try the session, it's going to give me an error, expected user session. So it's this new framework around like these little hook things. You can compose them. You probably won't be accessing use session directly. You probably will be writing these little hooks around it and composing these together. So yeah, and I think that is it for the demo. Let me see if there's anything else in my notes that I forgot. We'll link after issue new session, show usage of session and types plus session. Cool. Let me just see if there's any questions. Please share on GitHub the code at the end. Yeah, so this I'm doing all this in the in our SST weekly repo. We should probably just rename that to like stream repo or something. I'll commit all this at the end, and you can all take a look. So yeah, that's everything for the demo. So if that's all you wanted to check out, feel free to drop off now. But from here, I'm going to go into some of the behind the scenes stuff. So we've been doing more of that with these launches. So you can see how some is implemented. Like I said with this, it's not really going to be about look how crazy and complicated it is. It's going to be look how stupid and simple this is. Implementing auth is actually pretty easy. So we'll jump into the SST code base. Whoa, what happened? Share my screen anymore? Did you guys release the context feature so we can get the hook stuff? So we haven't done that yet. This is our first, like real usage of context. We're using it under the hood for auth. It's technically all public, so you can dig through the code and use all the context hooks and stuff. But we haven't documented it yet. We're gonna like let this sit for a little bit and then see if it's something that does make sense. All right, let me share my screen again. I don't know why it went away. Entire screen. Okay. All right. So hang on. Let me just wait for the stream to catch up to see if it. All right. Oh, another question. Would you recommend that the use session wrapper over path as context for validating a user before GraphQL calls? Yeah, so this is a good question. So GraphQL has this nice concept of context where you can specify it like basically before the GraphQL function starts to run, or like the first thing it does when it runs. You can do some initialization logic, and you can create a context object, and you can pass that and that gets passed in explicitly to every single path handler. You can do that. Like you can like pull a session out and return it there. I found that with this new hooks concept and this context concept, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and I've talked about a little bit in some of our other videos if you want to take a look, it's more convenient just to call these hooks where you need them. The trouble with the context callback is you kind of need to preload every possible thing you need in there. By using these hooks, like some of these hooks can do stuff like checking permissions, reading from the database. You don't want to do that all up front because who knows if the GraphQL query will even need that. So it's nice to be able to do that like at the last minute, right when you need it. That way you'll know that's not doing any extra work that it doesn't strictly need to. So I've been preferring doing the hook stuff. Sorry, not using the context at all. I used to use it and I switched to this new setup now. All right, so how does all this work under the hood? So I guess I'll start with the constructs. The construct is really simple. I don't usually write our constructs. Frank usually writes them, but this one was so simple that I was able to do it myself. So we have this new auth construct. It doesn't take much, right? When you initialize it, just that function that you pass in. And when you attach it, you can attach an API and you can specify a prefix for the path that's going to take over. And that's what I described is mostly all it does. So the most interesting thing it does is managing a bunch of secrets for you. So with these issuing these sessions, you need to have like a signing key for it. And typically it's something you need to generate yourself. If you look at stuff like Next.js, Next.js, I think it's Next.js. I always mess that up. They have a little section in their tutorial, their docs, that says, okay, before you go to production, make sure you use OpenSSL to generate this little secret and upload it to an environment variable so that we're actually signing these securely. So that's something, if you notice in our flow, you don't have to do at all. And the reason is we can build on top of this new secrets framework to do all of this for you. So the way this works is we don't actually generate. So there's two ways to sign GWT tokens. You can just do like a simple secret, or you can do a public-private key pair. A public-private key pair is kind of annoying. So if you're going to do this yourself, you probably won't do that. And the next auth, it's a great example. They don't tell you to do that. There's nice benefits to splitting it between public and private. But because we're handling it for you, we can definitely do a lot of this for you. So, sorry, I got distracted. That's what we're doing here. We're initializing these two secrets, public key and the private key. We're not actually setting any values here. We're just kind of defining, okay, these secrets are going to exist. And what we actually do is we create a custom resource that loads these when you first create the construct. So this custom resource is just a function, and we actually picked a new architecture for this that we're trying to move towards. If you notice that we have this new SST, this little like function, this custom resource that gets deployed per stack, with our new metadata thing that Frank went over in our last SST weekly, that function was doing the work of uploading all the metadata to S3. Because we already have a function there, we can now reuse it for more stuff. One thing we really don't like about CDK is it deploys a bunch of functions for various constructs, right? If you like deploy a S3 bucket, it's going to deploy a function that's used to delete everything. You can delete the bucket. It's nice because this lets CDK build more advanced functionality, but it kind of creates a mess in your AWS console. It's like another function is taking up your function limit, things like that. So what we're trying to do is have a single function. So it's the only function we're ever going to need to deploy per stack, and we're going to load any type of custom logic we need to do into that. So this is our first iteration of doing that. We did it for the metadata. Now we're doing it for this secret key generation. So this custom resource, I'll show you the code for it. It's actually pretty simple. There's new support folder. So again, when this auth contract is created, it's going to create this custom function. It's going to basically execute once. And this does not look right. Hang on. This is the wrong thing. This is not used. It's this one. Okay, so this custom function is going to run when your auth contract is created. It's going to generate a public private key pair, and we do everything here correctly, so you don't have to worry about it. And we store those in the two secrets that we created. And then if you delete the construct, of course, it's going to delete the secrets. So these secrets are completely managed for you, right? It's almost like a managed service. We're creating these keys. You don't have to worry about them. We need to provide a way for you to rotate them, but I mean, we kind of talk about the API for that, but it probably won't be needed right away. So we manage all the keys for you. It's very convenient. Okay, so far, create the secrets, create a custom resource which will run, and that's really all it does when you create the construct. Then when you attach it to an API, we basically add these paths, right? So we add a little, so by default, it's going to be that /auth path that I showed you earlier. It's going to handle all requests to it and forward it to this authenticator function. And that is about it. So the reason we do the public-private combo instead of a single secret is we want to limit the access to sensitive values as much as we can. So the authenticator function needs access to the private key because it's going to issue new sessions. But the rest of your functions don't need access to the private key, right? They're not going to issue new sessions. They're just going to validate that a session was issued correctly. So the rest of your functions just get access to the public key. The public key is not sensitive. You can literally go post it on Twitter and nobody can do anything with it. All they can do is validate that the sessions were issued by the private key. And this is the reason we did this public private key pair. If you just do the simple JWT single token thing, you're gonna have to use the same token for issuing and same token for validating. So now technically your all of your functions have access to the most important secret in your application, most likely. So by doing this public private split under the hood, only your authenticator function has access to the sensitive one, and everything else it has access to something that's not sensitive at all. Let me look at the questions here. Is there a trigger system like Cognito? So we actually don't need a separate trigger system because you just have the callbacks, right? In the on success callback, you can do whatever you need there. If there are situations where you feel like you need a callback, like let us know. We'll see how we need to work that into the API. Any concerns with session tokens being shared through query params? Think of these tokens on open logs. I know cookies, create options. Yeah. So I like the cookie option for storing the token. It takes a little bit more work of setup, and we have this documented in our docs. You have to add some cores specifications on your API. But if you do it there, your front end can be completely unaware of this whole auth scheme. So I recommend considering the cookie option. Yeah, passing in the token to the query parameters might mean it ends up in logs somewhere. The Problem magic link is if your mail is compromised, a hacker can authenticate to your app. So yeah, this comes up a lot, but if you look at most applications, they already have a forgot password flow. Pretty much most applications already have magic link login just through their forgot password. You can basically throw away your password and use a forgot password flow every time, which is the same as magic link. So usually with passwords, you need to implement this email escape hatch anyway. So it's kind of like, let's just use that for everything. It gives a stateless auth. Hate those. Public key, PKSK. I don't know what that is, but if we're helping with that, I'm glad we are. Okay, so this is entirely the construct. So like I said, the construct's simple. Its job is really just to add a few new routes to your API and provide some, like this key generation thing. If we jump into the Node app side of things, we have this new auth package. And the first thing we export is AuthHandler. So the AuthHandler doesn't do anything that crazy. If it's a root thing, it's going to render that playground thing. Nothing that interesting there. Basically, what it's going to do is, depending on the path, it's going to invoke one of your providers. So to look up the provider that you specified, it might be Link, it might be Google, whatever you named it, and then it'll call this provider function that you passed in. And that triggers one of these adapters. So if you look at the adapters is actually really simple. The interface for an adapter is just something that handles an API gateway request. So it's more or less like you just implement a Lambda function that can do different things. So if you look at our set of adapters, we don't have that many, but because we have this OAuth no IDC based ones, you can pretty much do whatever you want with them. So let's take a look at, let's see, OIDC one. OIDC adapter, it basically implements 2 steps. So this is all the code there is for it. If you look, we're not doing much. The reason why we're not doing much is because there is already a official OpenID client that is endorsed by Auth0 actually, that does the entire OIDC handshake correctly, and the API is great. That's well maintained. So we didn't have to implement all the details of OIDC from ground up. We just basically wrote the code that you would if you were using this library. So if you look at what we do here, we just initialize a new issuer. Right, an issuer, all it just needs is a client ID and the callback URL that it's going to post to once the user's done doing authorization. The first step is authorization. And there's a bunch of little things you need to get right here, like you need to generate this nonce, the state. So again, it's stuff that you would just do yourself if you were implementing this yourself. You set those in cookies, and this is all so that you prevent stuff like cross-site scripting, things like that. And then once the user, that initializes the authentication flow. And then once the user's done, we're going to get a callback. We are going to parse the data. We're going to verify that the nonce and the state are correct. And we're going to get the token set by just, again, calling to this great library. And then we trigger your on success, and that's it. Your on success will receive the claims, and you can redirect. Like I showed earlier, you can generate a session and redirect. Sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on the comments. Okay, so this is our OIDC adapter. So at the end of the day, adapters aren't anything crazy. They look just like a normal Lambda function that handles an API route. The only thing that we're doing that's a little bit weird is this handles more than one API route, because we didn't want to, it simplifies it to just have one thing that does this. So it does both the authorization and the callback. Okay. The next thing is, let's look at the link adapter. So this one's a little bit different, right? This is a completely different authentication flow, but it still looks pretty similar. So there's also an authorization step, but in this authorization step, we just generate a new URL with the claims, and we will append the token, which you can now, and this URL you can forward to, we'll call this on-link callback. They'll get this URL, you can forward it to the email. And we're signing this link with the same private key that I showed you that we're generating earlier. Once they click the URL, they will get to this callback step, and we will verify this using the public key, and we will call on success with the claims that were passed through. So very simple. There's like a 64 lines of code for this. We can imagine if we implement a pin code adapter, it's going to be somewhat similar, except the way we're going to do that here is we're going to actually generate the pin code here, encrypt it, and then seal it in a token. So that's how we make it stateless on the back end. They can't like inspect it because they don't have the private key to decrypt. Um, and then in the callback, we will read the cookie and see if the pin that they're giving us is the same as a pin that's sealed in the cookie. This is not a flow I made up. There's a library called Iron Session that basically has this exact flow. It's used by everything. I think next off JS uses it as well. Cool. And then these are some of the adapters we have out of the box, right? But you can also create your own adapter. If this Google adapter doesn't work, if you can't just use the OAuth adapter by passing in the configuration here, you can make your own for whatever flow you want. I realistically don't think people will be making them for anything third party, because if you make something for third party, just submit a PR and we'll integrate it and it'll be native, it won't be custom. But it's very useful for things like multi-tenant. And I'm going to pull up the docs for this. I have a little example there. So there might be a situation where you have a multi-tenant application. Most users or most organizations just use email magic link auth, but some people maybe have Google Auth set up, SAML Auth set up, that you might want to conditionally do a different auth strategy for. So this is how you can do like a little multi-tenant adapter. So you can you can pass in a tenant ID in the query parameter. So you can say, okay, this person is trying to log in for tenant one. You can look up the tenant info, and you can say, okay, if tenant info has Google Auth enabled, let's just return the Google adapter. Otherwise, return the link adapter. So yeah, this is a custom adapter, but it's really just delegating to other adapters. But the idea is this is really just a Lambda function. You can have it do whatever you need it to. Cool. So let me see. What else can I go over? So I can pull up my notes again. Oh, I don't think I saved them. Second. All right, my notes. AuthHandler, adapter OIDC. Oh, the use session stuff. Let's take a look at that. You know, I really miss my legit setup. I've gotten used to a little streaming stuff I set up, but let's see. Yep. Oh. Okay, so use session, how does this work? So in our docs, I think Jay wrote up earlier a little bit of background about our context system with a bunch of warnings everywhere because we haven't settled on the full API for it. Actively worked on, subject to change. So you can take a look here if you want the full explanation, but I'll go over a little bit about that now. So if you look at our session provider, session library, we have a bunch of these weird calls to context here, use session. So explain how this works. So this use session hook uses our new context system. So what is context? So context is a way to store a piece of state that lasts for the current Lambda request. So at the beginning of every Lambda request, all the contexts in the application will be wiped. And if they're accessed again, they'll be rebooted. And they're booted lazily. So it's a nice alternative to middleware where you can kind of selectively use different things. And the way this works is we have this session context, and this is a memoized context. I'll explain what this is in a second. But this basically does the work of extracting the token from the various ways you can send it, right? So it might come in a header, call use header, get this header out. It might come in a cookie, if it comes in a cookie, get it from the cookie. do the actual verification using signing token and return it. Otherwise, say, okay, this is a public session. It's not one that has been signed with this specific token. Memo means if you call use session like 10 times inside a single Lambda request, this code is only ever going to run once. So yeah, it's efficient. Like this logic will only run once if it's ever called. If you go through a flow that never hits use session, this code doesn't get run at all. And that's nice because when you look at the middleware approach, you kind of have to top down define, oh, these are all the things that this function will eventually need. So I need to preload everything. These hooks kind of invert that. So a use session call can be somewhere deep down. The code at your function level doesn't really have to be aware of that. If use session does eventually get called, this memo thing will get triggered and loaded. And that's really all we're using context for this. I'll jump into a little bit about context here. So maybe I'll go into these like use header, use cookie, I'll kind of unwind all the way up. So we have a bunch of these HTTP hooks. These are not released. I think you can technically access them, but we have not documented them and they might change. So if we look at something simple like the use header one. So use header, we'll call use headers to get the list of headers. Use headers, we'll call use event, which gets the current event, and it's going to assert that's an API. If you watch my context preview video, I go into how the type safety works here. And use event just returns the current event that's there. If you try to access, if you hit code that's expecting an API event, but you're somehow in like an SQS handler, it's going to throw an error and fail. And this request context just gets set at the beginning of every Lambda request. And that's why we have these new handlers, the GraphQL handler, the Auth handler. We have like a generic API handler now. These boot up this whole context system and make sure that request is assigned. So we like the API. It works. It's nice and composable. But we want to let it run for a little bit to see if there's any issues. I haven't used it extensively. A lot of the stuff that I ship into SST, I will have used in my own app for 6 months or so before it makes it into SST itself. Context is still somewhat new. I've been using it in a different form for a while, and it's great. But I want to like see if this new flavor of it makes sense before we release it. So you can technically poke around the code and use it if you want, but we don't officially support that yet. All right. So I think that is everything that I had for this launch. Nice. It only took an hour. I thought it was going to be a lot longer, which is good. So let me see. So just to recap. So again, SC Auth is now released. You can use it for any API setup you have with SST. I think if you are using Cognito currently, even with passwords, this is a way you can switch to this and switch to the email link auth. Definitely recommend everyone to try it. What we released now is a really solid base. Like we have the sessions, we have the adapters, but over time we want this to be a lot more complete. So there's other providers you need, if there's other auth strategies you need, if there's issues with the session stuff we have, right now is a great time to bring that up. We can probably rapidly implement these as we go on now that the base is there. So yeah, that's all from me. I'll hang out for a couple minutes to see if there's any questions. But otherwise, thank you everyone for joining and hope this seems useful. StreamYard's got this new music thing. Let's see. This is music that we like. Or maybe, is it new? I don't know. I think this has been there for a while. Is it easy to implement 2FA with AWS? So Cognito does have 2FA built in. SST Auth does not have a way to do 2FA yet. I think in general, we're trying to solve people using a third party for authentication for the most part. We can eventually look into doing 2FA. Again, we want to make sure we can do this all in a stateless way. If we can't do it super effectively, we likely might not end up supporting it, but it is an area I haven't explored super deeply yet. So if you have a use case where you want 2FA native in your app, let me know, kind of talk about how you want to use it. Love to hear why you don't want to use a third-party provider instead. That was one of the benefits of using something like Google for login, because they will implement all that really, really well with like decent UX and everything. I have plans to create an adapter for Okta. Yes, so we can definitely do an adapter for Okta. I actually wanted to do one for SAML in general. So if you're doing any kind of like SSO implementation, like integration, this is usually for B2B applications. So if you want to let people sign in with their own business account, a lot of companies are using Google now, so you can use a Google adapter. But we do want to support SAML login, which Okta does support, and then we can also do like an Okta specific adapter. So that's something we can think about. I think if you combine that with this multi-tenant custom adapter I showed you, where you can like have a custom Okta adapter depending on which tenant it's for, that'll probably work out really well. All right. Well, looks like that's all the questions. So I'm going to jump off. Thanks everyone for joining again. If you have any questions, of course, I'm on Discord. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. See you all later.